There's one photo from Meghan Markle's royal wedding that most people scroll past without a second thought. But look closer, because that single frame holds more truth than 1,000 tabloid headlines ever could. It's not Meghan's dress, not Harry's grin, not even the royal fanfare echoing through Windsor Castle. It's Doria Ragland, sitting alone, isolated on a pew while the most famous family on earth fills the opposite side of the chapel. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no father. Just one woman, holding the entire weight of Meghan's world on her shoulders. And make no mistake, this wasn't some accidental seating oversight. It was a statement, a quiet visual declaration of who showed up and who didn't. The bride's own mother, surrounded by strangers, royal tradition, and global scrutiny, was left to represent an entire bloodline, all by herself. For a moment, Doria wasn't just a guest. She was a symbol of survival, of sacrifice, of silent loyalty. But what the cameras didn't catch, what no press release dared to say, is that the tension that day didn't start with the wedding. And it definitely didn't end there, because behind that calm exterior was a storm years in the making. And the fallout from that very moment would go on to shake Meghan's inner circle to its core. But this story isn't about a wedding. It's about a mother who may have finally had enough. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, packed with 600 elite guests, royalty, celebrities, dignitaries, all dressed to the nines. Every camera in the world is trained on the aisle, waiting for the biggest royal event since William and Kate. But tucked quietly in the crowd, unnoticed by most, sat a woman whose presence would come to define the emotional undercurrent of the entire ceremony, Doria Ragland. She was Meghan Markle's only family member in attendance. One seat, one woman, one massive silence on the bride's side of the chapel. Now, let that sink in. While the entire British royal family was seated together across the aisle, Charles, Camilla, William, Kate, the Queen herself, Meghan's mother sat alone. No one was beside her. No siblings, no cousins, no father walking the bride down the aisle. Just Doria, calm, composed, and, perhaps most tellingly, isolated. It wasn't a glitch in the seating chart. It wasn't a mistake. This was a visual message, a quiet but bold statement to the world. Meghan's side of the family had crumbled, and the one person still standing by her side was doing it alone, surrounded by centuries of tradition that had never made space for someone like her. Meanwhile, Thomas Markle, Meghan's father, was embroiled in a scandal. Just 5 days before the wedding, he pulled out of walking his daughter down the aisle. The reason? A staged paparazzi scandal involving rehearsed tuxedo fittings and fake candid photos, reportedly for a 6-figure payout. The entire world watched in shock as the father of the bride became the headline instead of the ceremony. With the wedding plans in chaos, the palace scrambled. And in a move that saved face for the royal institution, Prince Charles stepped in to walk Meghan down the aisle. A last-minute decision dressed up as a noble gesture, but behind the scenes, it was damage control. In contrast, Doria didn't cause a stir. She didn't issue public statements or stage photos. She showed up, followed protocol, and represented her daughter with dignity. She was briefed by palace staff, supported every step of the way, and treated as a VIP, because everyone understood the weight she was carrying. And yet, despite the elegance, despite the composure, one truth stood out like a sore thumb. Meghan Markle's entire family story was unraveling in front of the world, and Doria Ragland was the only one left holding the thread. But that thread was already beginning to fray. 5 days before Meghan's royal wedding, the headlines weren't about the dress, or the vows, or the fairy tale setting. They were about a man named Thomas Markle, Meghan's father, caught in a media circus of his own making. Photos of him casually browsing wedding coverage, getting fitted for a suit, flipping through a coffee table book about British landmarks. At first glance, it looked heartwarming, like a proud father preparing for the big day. But the truth was far more calculated. Those photos weren't candid. They were staged, reportedly arranged for a payout nearing $100,000. And when the news broke, the fallout was immediate. The royal family, obsessed with image, control, and protocol, was blindsided. This wasn't just a PR nightmare. It was a breach of trust on an international scale. Suddenly, the father of the bride had become a global punchline. Within hours, Thomas Markle pulled out of the wedding, citing health issues. But by then, the damage was done. The palace had to pivot fast, reworking the order of events, reshuffling the guest list, and addressing a glaring absence no one could ignore. A father is missing, a bride walking solo, and a media machine dissecting every angle. Enter Prince Charles, calm, regal, and always ready for optics. He stepped in as Meghan's stand-in escort, offering a stabilizing image to offset the chaos. The press spun it as a beautiful gesture. In reality, it was triage. But while the cameras focused on Charles and Meghan walking down the aisle, another narrative was unfolding. Quieter, but just as powerful. Doria Ragland, sitting alone, didn't flinch. No public statements, no dramatics, just poise. Meanwhile, Meghan's half-siblings saw their moment, and took it. Samantha Markle, already making noise in the press, ramped up her campaign. Interviews, accusations, even a book in the works. Her narrative? That Meghan had changed. That fame had built walls, not bridges. She painted herself as the silenced sister left behind. And then came Thomas Jr., who didn't just run to the press. He wrote an open letter to Prince Harry, a literal, hand-delivered plea. In it, he warned Harry that Meghan was a mistake, that she would ruin the royal family, that she was toxic. It read like a tabloid fever dream, but it landed with a thud in every newsroom from LA to London. The palace, already strained, had no choice but to go into full containment mode. Behind the scenes, staff scrambled to distance the monarchy from Meghan's family drama. Seating charts were redrawn. Briefings were tightened. Every second of the ceremony became a landmine of optics. But through it all, Doria never cracked. While Meghan's father sold photos and her siblings sold interviews, Doria sold nothing. She didn't flinch when her ex-husband humiliated their daughter. She didn't run to the media with her own story. She sat in that chapel, surrounded by royals and strangers, and carried the dignity of an entire broken family on her shoulders. It was the calm before the storm, because what came next would shake even that quiet composure. For a while, it looked like Doria Ragland had become Meghan and Harry's secret weapon. After the wedding, after the Netflix deal, after the Spotify flameout, and all the headlines about stepping back, Doria was still there, still calm, still composed, still loyal. When things got messy, she moved in. Literally. In 2024, the 68-year-old yoga teacher quietly relocated to the Sussex's $13 million Montecito mansion, reportedly to help raise Archie and Lilibet during a difficult time. Publicly, it was framed as a loving grandmother offering support. Privately, it was damage control. Harry and Meghan were stretched thin, juggling legal drama, failing media deals, and a growing sense of isolation in Hollywood. Doria was the steady presence holding things together. But slowly, something began to shift. Reports started trickling out. Small details at first. Doria was spotted alone at events that Meghan was expected to attend. Meghan is reusing old photos of her mom on social media. Insiders whispering that things inside Montecito weren't as peaceful as they seemed. And then the bombshell. Radar Online reported that Doria Ragland had officially moved out of the mansion. Not for a vacation, not for a break. For good. Sources claimed she couldn't take it anymore. That Meghan's constant moaning, the emotional outbursts, and the nonstop drama had worn her down. That Doria, who had once been praised for her serenity, had finally reached her limit. And when she packed her bags, Meghan reportedly panicked. One insider said she literally begged her mom, "Don't leave me," but she left anyway. The final straw? Allegedly, Doria attended a Beyoncé concert without Meghan, and without even telling her. For anyone else, that might sound trivial. But in the hyper-controlled world of Meghan Markle's public image, it was a message, a boundary, a subtle rebellion from a woman who had been cast as the ever-present supporter. For someone like Meghan, who's built her brand on loyalty, family resilience, and curated authenticity, Doria's departure was a quiet earthquake. No press release, no dramatic public fallout, just a silent exit that left the entire Montecito operation looking a little hollow. Because here's what no one wants to say out loud. When even your own mother walks away from your multi-million-dollar lifestyle, something's gone very, very wrong. Doria had been the emotional anchor, the calming force, the maternal figure who held Meghan's chaos together during the storm of royal drama, media attacks, and public scrutiny. And when that anchor cuts loose, you drift, and fast. But the whispers didn't stop there. Some say Doria felt used, pulled into interviews and documentaries to lend credibility to a narrative she didn't fully believe. Others point to subtle moments during the Netflix series where Doria looked more like a prop than a participant, smiling on cue, saying what needed to be said, but never fully relaxed. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Meghan's inner circle had lost its core, and with Doria gone, the entire image of stability started to crack. The tabloids pounced. The "Don't leave me" quote became a headline. The Beyoncé concert became a symbol. And Doria? She didn't deny any of it. She just left, and that silence was deafening. Because if Doria Ragland, the woman who sat alone at the royal wedding, the woman who defended Meghan against the world, the woman who moved into their mansion to help raise their children, finally said, "Enough is enough," then maybe, just maybe, things behind the palace gates of Montecito were a lot darker than anyone thought. And what happened next would shock everyone. After the wedding, after the royal split, and after the media hailstorm that followed them to California, Meghan Markle had one thing left in her corner that still garnered universal sympathy: her mother. Doria Ragland, quiet and poised, had survived the press, the royal scrutiny, and the volcanic dysfunction of the Markle clan, without saying a single controversial word. And Meghan knew it. She knew her mother wasn't just her emotional anchor. She was public relations gold, which is exactly why Doria became a centerpiece in the Sussexes' next major move, the Netflix documentary. In Harry and Meghan, Doria finally spoke. Not much, but just enough. She gave soft commentary. She smiled on cue. She praised Harry. She nodded at the right moments. It was subtle, warm, and carefully edited. And for many viewers, it was the most authentic part of the entire series. The calm, motherly presence in a sea of spectacle. But not everyone bought it. Critics began to notice something odd. Doria's screen time was minimal, her lines were general, and her tone felt reserved. Some wondered, was she fully on board? Or was she playing along for the sake of her daughter? Others pointed to the broader pattern, how Doria had been increasingly used to validate Meghan's more controversial narratives. Take, for instance, the racial angle. The Netflix series leaned heavily into the racism Meghan allegedly faced in the royal family, the media, and British society. And Doria, being visibly black, composed, and maternal, was the perfect symbol to underscore that message. But some critics argued that this was less about genuine storytelling and more about optics. In fact, whispers began to surface that Doria had grown uncomfortable with being used as a shield, a way to deflect criticism and reinforce Meghan's image as a wronged woman of color navigating a hostile world. One royal watcher put it bluntly, Doria's presence was meant to remind us Meghan has black roots, but Doria didn't look like she was driving the message, just nodding along with it. And then something even more revealing happened. Doria all but vanished. After the documentary, she wasn't seen with Meghan in public. No social media updates, no pap shots, no birthday tributes. Meghan, who had once posted old photos of her mom with gushing captions, went silent. And when she did reference Doria, it was always with throwback pictures, never anything recent. Insiders claimed it wasn't just distance, it was detachment. Behind the scenes, Doria was reportedly uncomfortable with how her image was being packaged and sold. She had entered the royal world as a private, grounded woman, but now she was being edited, scripted, and repurposed. And for someone who had lived most of her life teaching yoga and staying out of the spotlight, the Netflix version of Doria wasn't who she really was. It was who Meghan needed her to be. By the time Doria's absence became noticeable, speculation exploded online. Was there a falling out? Was she distancing herself? Had she seen too much? Meghan, known for tightly controlling her narrative, said nothing. But the silence was louder than any statement. Fans started questioning why the woman who had been front and center at the wedding, the christenings, the baby showers, and the documentaries, was suddenly nowhere to be found. And then came the photos. Meghan began using old shots of Doria, years old, sometimes decades old, edited, filtered, polished, but noticeably out of date. One particularly jarring moment was a reposted childhood picture of Meghan and her mom, while Doria was rumored to be living separately. To critics, it looked less like a tribute and more like a prop. Because if Doria was truly still in Meghan's corner, why the radio silence? Some say Doria felt trapped, that she had given everything, her loyalty, her presence, her image, and was now being used as a backdrop in Meghan's rebranding strategy. Others say she simply got tired of the noise, of the chaos, of the subtle pressure to smile for the camera while pretending everything was fine. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. The woman who once sat alone at the royal wedding, strong and silent, had now chosen silence of a different kind. Not on camera, not in interviews, but in life. She stepped back, and for Meghan Markle, that silence created a void no Netflix edit could fill. But Doria's quiet retreat wasn't the final twist, because just when things seemed like they couldn't get more complicated, Meghan's ancestry revealed a lit match under everything. It started with a headline that should have been celebratory, a personal moment, a cultural connection, a story of heritage and pride. Meghan Markle revealed she was 43% Nigerian, a DNA result that on its surface felt like a bridge back to her roots. But in the age of algorithms, PR spin, and online outrage, even a simple ancestry report can morph into a media minefield. Within hours, the internet did what it does best: dig, dissect, and debate. Critics and commentators pounced. Some questioned the timing. Why now? Why this specific revelation? Why emphasize it so publicly when Meghan had always walked a tightrope between her biracial identity and her culturally white public persona? Others asked whether the move was a genuine exploration or damage control dressed as DNA. And right there in the middle of it all, quiet, poised, and suddenly scrutinized again, was Doria Ragland. Because when the narrative turned toward identity, ancestry, and race, it inevitably brought Doria back into the spotlight. The woman who had been used to reinforce Meghan's image during the Netflix documentary was now being scrutinized for what she didn't say. No Instagram post, no quote. Just a casual blink-and-you miss it comment during an interview on The Daily Show, where Doria briefly acknowledged Meghan's Nigerian ancestry. But it felt distant, measured, almost clinical. Observers began to question whether Doria's subdued reaction meant something more. Had she grown tired of being part of her daughter's carefully calculated PR arcs? Was she quietly pushing back on the narrative that used her identity to soften Meghan's public image? Or was this just another example of Meghan projecting significance onto a moment that didn't truly belong to her? The debate got louder. People asked, how could Meghan suddenly lean into her Nigerian roots after years of barely referencing her Black identity in any meaningful cultural way? Where was the connection before? Where were the visits, the advocacy, the cultural conversations? Critics argued this wasn't pride, it was optics. A convenient rebranding effort in the wake of public backlash, fading influence, and fractured support from both the media and Hollywood elites. And once again, Doria's silence spoke volumes. She had watched her daughter become a global figure, walking red carpets, making declarations about identity, monetizing their pain and privacy into multi-million-dollar deals. And while Meghan's brand twisted itself to match whatever cause or controversy was trending, Doria remained grounded. A woman who had lived a quiet life, who practiced yoga and drove herself to work, who was suddenly being asked to play a recurring role in a show she never auditioned for. Some insiders even claimed Doria wasn't comfortable with how Meghan had weaponized race, as both a shield and a spotlight, that she had whispered caution behind closed doors, that she worried about how identity was being used, not explored. And as Meghan's DNA announcement spiraled into think pieces, TikToks, and trending hashtags, the tension became impossible to ignore. Because this wasn't just about heritage, it was about strategy. Every move Meghan made now seemed to be filtered through a lens of branding, from the perfectly curated Spotify podcast to the now defunct children's content empire. Every revelation was tied to a rollout. So when Meghan told the world she was 43% Nigerian, people didn't hear connection. They heard calculation. And for Doria, that might have been the final straw. Friends close to the family noted that Doria had begun stepping back, not just physically, but emotionally. She didn't want to be part of the noise. She didn't want to be the black mom trotted out to authenticate narratives that weren't hers. She didn't want to be a passive participant in a brand she no longer recognized. Because when identity becomes a marketing tool, even truth starts to feel like a performance. And Doria Ragland? She wasn't a performer. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman who'd stood silently in the eye of a media hurricane and kept her dignity intact. And maybe, just maybe, she realized that staying silent wasn't enough anymore. Maybe she realized she had to walk away. But stepping away from the chaos wouldn't make it disappear. Because what came next exposed just how deep the fracture had grown, far beyond PR strategy or royal fallout. It was personal now, and irreversible. For years, Doria Ragland was the unshakable constant in Meghan Markle's ever-changing orbit. The tabloids, the Netflix deals, the Spotify collapse, the lawsuits, the PR pivots, through it all, she was there. Calm, soft-spoken, loyal, the only family member who hadn't cashed in on interviews or books. The only one who seemed to protect Meghan from the chaos, rather than add to it. But every anchor has its breaking point. By mid-2024, whispers had turned into full-blown reports. Radar Online revealed that Doria had quietly packed up and left the $13 million Montecito mansion she'd been sharing with Meghan, Harry, Archie, and Lilibet. The reason? According to insiders, she was done. Done with the constant drama, the Grand Duchess lifestyle, the emotional demands, and the sense that she'd become not a grandmother, but a live-in crisis manager. Sources painted an increasingly stark picture. Doria had moved in to help with the children during a difficult time, but what was supposed to be a temporary act of support turned into a full-time role. Meghan, overwhelmed by legal battles and Hollywood projects, leaned on her mother more and more. Harry, reportedly struggling with his own mental load, came to see Doria as a steadying force as well. Before long, the 68-year-old yoga instructor was essentially running the Sussex household, cooking, child-minding, offering emotional support, and playing public prop when needed. And it wore her down. Insiders say Doria had begun to feel like a supporting character in Meghan's brand rather than her own person. She watched as old photos of herself were recycled on Meghan's social accounts, while new pictures were conspicuously absent. She watched as her private identity, yogi, social worker, grandmother, was subsumed into a PR narrative about loyalty and race. She watched her daughter beg her not to leave, reportedly crying, "Don't leave me." And one day, she just left. The exit itself was quiet. No announcement, no Instagram post, no hint of a rift. Just a grandmother walking out of a mansion with her suitcase. But in the Sussexes' tightly controlled image machine, that silence spoke louder than any statement. For someone as disciplined and private as Doria, leaving Montecito wasn't just a logistical decision, it was a boundary. A declaration that her peace mattered more than her proximity. Even the symbolism of her absence was potent. Weeks after her move out, Doria was photographed at a Beyoncé concert, without Meghan. For the first time, she was seen enjoying herself publicly, without being tethered to her daughter's brand. Critics called it a subtle act of liberation. Fans called it the softest clapback ever. And behind the headlines, the ripple effect was real. Without Doria in the house, Meghan's world began to look less anchored. Harry, once openly affectionate toward his mother-in-law, was now without the one adult in the household who could diffuse tension. Meghan, deprived of her most loyal confidant, found herself under intensified scrutiny as her authentic family narrative began to fray. The woman who had sat alone at the royal wedding as a symbol of unshakable support was now a ghost. But the most telling part of Doria's exit wasn't the departure itself. It was what she reportedly said as she left. According to a family source quoted in multiple outlets, Doria told friends she was happy with how the family is doing now, but ready to concentrate on her own life. That wasn't a jab. It wasn't a tabloid-ready meltdown. It was a soft, polite goodbye from someone who had given enough. The price of peace was stepping away. And for Meghan Markle, losing her mother's full-time presence wasn't just a personal blow. It was a PR one. Her brand, the one built on family loyalty, resilience, and a narrative of being wronged by everyone except her mother, suddenly looked incomplete. Without Doria, the image of the strong mother-daughter bond felt less like a story and more like a memory. In a way, Doria's exit mirrored the very image that started this saga, her sitting alone at Meghan's wedding. Back then, she was a lone figure, representing unwavering loyalty. Now she was a lone figure again, this time walking out of a Montecito mansion, choosing herself over the chaos she'd helped contain. And for the palace, the press, and Meghan's critics alike, it was proof of something they'd suspected but never said aloud. Even the calmest, kindest people have a limit. But this limit wasn't just about drama, it was about survival. Because what happens when the last stabilizing force leaves? The answer would force Meghan Markle to face something she'd avoided for years: life without her mother as her safety net. At the core of the royal wedding, and everything that unraveled after, was a cultural collision so stark, so combustible, it couldn't be ignored. Meghan Markle didn't just marry into the British royal family, she crashed into it. And not just as an American, but as a woman from a fractured, outspoken, unapologetically public family. A family that clashed with everything the royals had spent centuries perfecting: silence, control, and tightly orchestrated image management. On one side of the aisle sat the Windsors, prim, polished, and painfully restrained. On the other, nothing. Just Doria Ragland, alone, still, and completely surrounded by centuries of pageantry that didn't quite know what to do with her. But Meghan's real family, the ones not invited, they didn't stay silent. Thomas Markle staged paparazzi photos for cash and collapsed under the weight of the scandal days before the wedding. Samantha Markle rolled out interviews like tabloid episodes, unleashing a stream of public grievances about fame, abandonment, and betrayal. Thomas Jr. took it one step further. He penned an open letter to Prince Harry, warning him not to marry his sister. The chaos wasn't whispered in dark corners or leaked through palace aides. It was broadcast, televised, tweeted, and devoured in real time. This wasn't just family dysfunction. It was American-style oversharing, set loose in the most secretive institution on earth. And that's when palace staff realized they weren't just planning a wedding. They were managing a media war. Every time Samantha opened her mouth, every time Thomas Sr. made a public statement, the palace had to scramble. Seating plans were restructured. Timing was adjusted. Entire chunks of protocol were rewritten to minimize visual reminders that Meghan's family, unlike Kate's or Diana's, was a powder keg. They couldn't control the narrative anymore because the narrative wasn't confined to the UK press. It was global, viral, instant. Doria, in contrast, played it perfectly. She was the anti-chaos. No tell-alls, no tweets, no teary morning shows. Just presence, quiet, respectful, regal in her own way. The palace clung to her like a lifeboat. They assigned staff to her, briefed her personally, made sure she was escorted at every turn. Because in a sea of Meghan's family drama, Doria was the only one who didn't make waves. But behind the optics, something deeper was happening. A cultural friction that shaped everything. Meghan's American side wasn't afraid to speak out, to fight dirty, to air grievances. It's how American media works. Conflict equals content. But the royal institution was built on the opposite. Silence equals strength. And the pressure to reconcile those two worlds fell not just on Meghan, but on Doria. She became the bridge, the peacemaker, the placeholder, the woman who could be photographed without risk, who could attend events without controversy, who could be trotted out as proof that Meghan wasn't entirely divorced from her roots. But that bridge started to crack. Doria wasn't just juggling cultural expectations, she was carrying them. Expected to behave royally while navigating a family that had never played by those rules. Expected to smile for cameras while her ex-husband sold family photos. And her daughter's siblings turned family trauma into morning show content. And all the while, the palace expected her to do it silently, graciously, without error. And she did. Until, eventually, she didn't. Because the cultural collision wasn't just a PR issue, it was a pressure cooker. British reserve clashed with American transparency. Royal secrecy clashed with Markle's scandal-mongering. The palace's centuries-old strategy of never complain, never explain clashed with a family that couldn't stop talking. And Doria? She was stuck in the middle, held up as the ideal, while absorbing the emotional whiplash behind the scenes. It's no wonder she walked away. And her absence made one thing painfully clear. The two worlds Meghan tried to unite, Hollywood and royalty, California freedom and Windsor tradition, were never meant to blend. They were always going to blow. And when they did, the person who had kept them from collapsing for years simply exited, because Doria Ragland may have been silent, but she wasn't blind. And what she saw behind those palace walls, and those Montecito ones, was a family dynamic that even centuries of royal etiquette couldn't hide. And even silence has its limits. But one image still lingers in everyone's mind, refusing to fade, no matter how many headlines follow. An image that now means something entirely different. An image that may have predicted all of this from the very beginning. There are thousands of photos from Meghan Markle's royal wedding, but only one truly tells the full story. It's not the sweeping shot of St. George's Chapel. It's not Meghan in her veil or Harry nervously smiling. It's Doria Ragland, sitting completely alone on the bride's side of the aisle. No siblings, no cousins, no one. Just her. A single woman surrounded by centuries of tradition, carrying the emotional weight of a broken family in silence. Back then, it looked like quiet dignity, a mother's love, a powerful image of support. But now, that image feels like a warning, because everything Doria represented that day, loyalty, restraint, grace under fire, was tested again and again in the years that followed. She was pulled into the Netflix machine, used as a PR prop to humanize her daughter's image, pressured to maintain peace in a household fueled by media addiction, brand building, and personal chaos. And somehow she did it all, without interviews, without drama, without lashing out. But even the calmest waters have an undertow. When Doria walked out of the Montecito mansion, suitcases in hand, Meghan begging her to stay, it wasn't just a personal decision. It was a turning point. The one woman who had held it all together, who had weathered every scandal, every headline, every whisper from both sides of the Atlantic, was finally done. And that quiet departure said more than any press release ever could. Because Doria wasn't just a mother, she was the symbol of everything Meghan claimed to value: loyalty, strength, and authenticity. And when she walked away, it shattered the illusion that Meghan's personal life was still rooted in anything solid. Her brand had leaned on Doria for credibility, for emotional resonance, for identity. Without her, it all started to look hollow. The cultural clash, the PR overdrive, the staged photos, the half-sibling chaos, the DNA announcements, none of it landed quite the same once the one truly grounded figure had left the stage. And that wedding photo? Is Doria sitting alone? It doesn't just capture a mother supporting her daughter. It captures the burden of being the only one holding things together while everyone else fell apart. And it turns out, even Doria Ragland, calm, loyal, composed, could only carry that weight for so long. Because in the end, she wasn't just a guest at the royal wedding. She was the foundation of Meghan's story. And now that foundation has quietly walked away, leaving the world to wonder what's left. When even the strongest support decides enough is enough, and if that was the calm, what comes next might just be the storm.